What I want to talk about today is a combination of things. It's agroecology, it's corporate agriculture, it's the negative effect, I think, on India and Indian agriculture and Indian industry, for that matter, though I'm not going to talk about it, but of the United States. And the things that have helped create in the United States today a society that is so unequal. It's more unequal than ever before in the history of European colonization in the United States, at least. There's been a significant increase in the absolute number of human beings suffering from malnutrition and persistent hunger in both the United States and India, not just in India. Children account for more than half of these. I also am going to talk about, and this is sort of by way of introduction, the role of speculation and gambling on what are called commodities, and the difference between food and commodities. And to talk about questions of distribution, both of food and of land to produce this food, which looms over all human beings' heads. The percentage, this is an old map, it's from 2007-8, but I couldn't find a more recent one, of people living on less than $1 a day worldwide. The map for the United States is incorrect because it looks as though there's nobody, but that's not true. There are many. I even have had one graduate student who was in that position. In New York. It's not easy. This also was the hunger index in India in 2008 by state. It's a little different today, but not as much as we would like. Okay. My talk today is focusing on the policies that breed hunger. And I'm going to be covering a bunch of interrelated issues. The struggle for food sovereignty, and I'll explain in a few minutes what food sovereignty means. Small farms versus corporate agriculture. GMOs and climate change, India's central government policies versus the states, and raise questions about what's happening to world agriculture, and also what can India learn from some of China's mistakes in following the US model. There have been two very, very unusual people who are the special rapporteurs for food security at the United Nations. And both of them have talked about the different foci, and they've talked about all the things that are needed to produce food security. They tend to be ignored a lot, but they've had very powerful positions, supposedly, officially. But in spite of that, it's clear that they're coming from different points of view than the establishment, especially since in the last 5-6 years, especially, corporations have begun to have influence on the United Nations. It's clear that the first focus, which is discussed in the next two slides, carries considerable economic, political, and military force behind it. The second focus, the following slides, carries the vast majority of human experience and knowledge. Which will come to dominate the world of the future remains to be seen. The first is what's called commodity focused. It limits crops. A commodity crop is only defined by the stock market and global trading. There are very few commodity crops. There's maize or corn, there's soy, and there are a few others, but not many. You can count them on your fingers. It is also environmentally harmful because concentrating on that, we have destroyed a hell of a lot of soil in the middle part of the United States, which then needs more and more regeneration, which it never gets, and so a lot of it is not even working. It's also totally dependent on the petroleum industry for all of its inputs. It's short-term field focus. There are no perennials. You don't want trees in your fields if you're driving in an absolutely enormous tractor, so you get rid of all the trees, even though the trees keep moisture in the soil, which means that they're healthy for the soil and healthy for agriculture. It creates erosion-prone situation, leaving fields fallow part of the year. It uses tremendous amounts of energy, which we can ill afford. and it's dependent on monopolistic seed and input companies. Farmers needing to take loans and depending on outside corporations. And there's a report available on the internet called the Rodale Report, which talks about some of that. It discourages new crops and innovative cropping patterns. The carbon focus is the exact opposite. It improves crop biodiversity, which rewards all kinds of farmers regardless of crops or acreage. It rewards green practices, emphasizing regenerative practices such as limiting erosion, improving soil health with worms, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which help us have a little less pollution in the air we have to breathe. Farmers are able to be more economically independent because even very small farmers are able to integrate the crops they grow and the animals they raise and other things like that. They have a much longer time frame for land use. They have many more perennial crops. For example, on the embankments between paddy fields, they're all, in many cases, traditional farmers are growing all kinds of trees. One of the things that I first started was in this area right here, in, I'm forgetting the name of the district. It's in one of these very dry districts where the Deccan Development Society are, where they were using neem trees on their boundaries in order to keep pests out of fields. They also push for intercropping, crop rotations, etc. And they're constantly adding things. They also reduce erosion by covering the land with growing crops for most of the year. So they're working to keep the land better. I should say, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, but I think there is a need for people in universities in a city like Hyderabad to also be in touch with organizations in Hyderabad or Secunderabad, which are focusing on sustainable agriculture, which are doing these things. These are NGOs started by local Indians, not by outsiders, not by foreigners, but are doing incredibly good work, and it's important to be aware of that. In any case, this approach also is energy saving because they reduce or in most cases eliminate petroleum-dependent chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides by using traditional practices for weeds and making use of animal waste and turning over of crops. They also spur local seed production, and they also use new innovations by local farmers and help local businesses with the growth of regional alliances. They create non-traditional opportunities to enter local food markets, providing food for local communities and nearby urban centers. They have stands on the road where they're selling organic food from their farms. They sell out very quickly, usually. I originally was going to show you some pictures of that. I will, at the very end, show you for those of you who don't know what SRI is, even though one of the best centers for studying it happens to be in Secunderabad, the Center for Sustainable Agriculture. But I have some pictures that I can pass around also of it, and a chart that's theirs, not mine, that explains it more. But before I go into that, let me talk about getting rich on hunger. And there are many people, not many, small numbers, but very wealthy people who are, in fact, getting rich on hunger. One of their jobs is the role as their role of agricultural traders is getting banks and pension funds to bet on various kinds of beans, wheat, rice, etc. High prices translate into misery and malnutrition. So how did investors get their hands on food? Who are the speculators? What does it all mean? They are investment banks, pension funds, hedge funds, grain traders, and rich individual traders. They're not large in number, but their wealth is enormous. It's even more so in the United States than in India, but in both places, their wealth is enormous. As noted in a very interesting journal called New Internationalist, with growing public revulsion of banks, maybe the time has begun to be ripe for a clampdown on speculation. And one of the people in an article there raised the question, is food for eating, or is it for indexing and leveraging or betting? What is food for? In the mid-20th century, when I first came to India, despite farm crises, there was a very strong commitment to social justice by much of the middle class, especially those who had been involved in the independence struggle, to self-sufficiency in basic food grains, and to meaningful land reform, though all were opposed by well-to-do elites. They were not so much. There was a commitment on the part of all political parties to work on poverty elimination directly, and to set up grain banks and ration shops for the poor to make purchases for day-to-day foodstuffs. What changed this? And before I go on, I should say that I have seen ration shops function very well also, at least for minimal requirements. And yes, it's true, it was in Kerala under the CPIM, but nonetheless, it made a difference where it did function. I know later on they began to not function as well in some places, but still. The Green Revolution, or at least in irrigated areas of the country, was sparked by very strong US influence. The US had decided that there was must be something wrong with Indian agriculture, instead of recognizing that Indian agriculture had been damaged by the colonial powers, who were only interested in where they could tax more or ship out of the country. They were not particularly, the British were not particularly tied to improving food supplies for Indians, except when they rioted. And it's really very different. But anyhow, the US were impressed by that. The switch to neoliberalism by the ruling classes in India replaced their early commitment to a just society. And some of that was under US force. In the early 1970s into the mid-1970s, the weather had changed. India still hadn't recovered from being independent, and they had to request imports of food from outside. At that time, President Johnson of the United States forced President Shastri to agree to give up paying attention to land reform in exchange for what they call PL 480 food. And that's something that people are not even aware of. And in fact, I found it in one document when I tried to, I had an Indian assistant helping me. When we tried to get back into that document, it had been taken off the internet. We're going to continue to pursue it, but it's very interesting. There also became a growing admiration of US agriculture by the middle classes, who want their food in plastic wrap. In the beginning of the 20th century, the signing of the Knowledge Agreement between the former President Bush and Manmohan Singh allowed for multinational corporations into India, including Monsanto, which again I see as something disastrous. So what are some of the myths that are perpetuated by corporate investors? One is the myth that individualism works best. Another is the belief that no form of socialism, even cooperatives, can work, despite the fact that in many parts of the world they have been successful, especially cooperatives, where you see, there are two kinds of cooperatives. Cooperatives that have very wealthy people as well as poor people in it, or cooperatives that are relatively equal, where maybe this one has 4 acres, that has 3.5, that has 2, that one has 5, but they're relatively equal. But where you have vast differences, they certainly do collapse. Another is the idea that human nature is fixed, that all human beings are unchanging and demand a me-first orientation. What's for me and my family is all that matters. Another is a belief that only corporations with their investors can solve today's major food problems, even though we in the United States have shown that farms growing some of these corporate things have lower yields, and I'll come to some statistics on that in a few seconds. And another one is the belief that the technological approaches, such as synthetic biology, can solve everyone's food problem and save the world without any testing. Synthetic biology is about the most frightening thing I have ever heard about. I heard it presented, must be about 4 or 5 years ago, at the United Nations under the ETC group. And if anyone wants to know more about it, you should Google the ETC group, because they have descriptions of it. But basically, it means that all biomatter is thrown into a cauldron, and then the multinational corporations will produce the food that everybody would eat. And it's absolutely frightening. I'd like to give you a few comparisons. First of all, between the corporate model and the alternatives. In the corporate model, multinational corporations control most food and farming operations. Large corporate farmers and smaller contract farmers with little autonomy grow most of the food, and they focus on world markets, not nearby markets. So they don't put anything in the nearby stand. Not only the nearby stand, they don't even give it to the nearby city. And there are other alternatives. The alternatives, talking both developed and developing countries, focus on family farms, which is the term used in the United States, small and medium-sized farms, as I said before, and cooperatives. They focus on local food production and the best of traditional farming and ecologically sound innovations such as SRI. Today, there are these two paradigms of production. The Green Revolution, which was this attempt to bring industrial techniques to India. I was working in Tamil villages and Kerala villages before the Green Revolution came in. And I saw how they tried to push it in. But I also read some of the Tamil Nadu and Kerala, but especially Tamil Nadu, district census handbooks. And the district census handbook for 1962 for South Arcot district in Tamil Nadu describes the equivalent of SRI. And that is what they were doing research on. These were young Indian research people who had had no influence on the West. Americans didn't like that. And Dr. Swaminathan at that time went along with not liking it. They attempt to manipulate plant genetics. They all require costly inputs. And they're dominated by global business, agribusiness. SRI, SCI, and SRI stands for the System of Rice Intensification. SCI is a system of crop intensification, which includes maize, wheat, sugarcane. There are at least 10 or 15 different crops that have been tried with, and we actually tried it in New York on a veranda with tomatoes. And one of the things is giving enough room for the roots to grow and for the roots to become stronger. SRI, SEI promote the growth of root systems. They create stronger plants that are resistant to climate fluctuations. And they increase enormously the abundance and diversity of soil organisms. And that's very, very important. The Green Revolution effects, on the other hand, affects finance. Seeds are expensive. Even now, hybrid seeds are even more expensive. You have to pay for everything. Farmers cannot make use of traditional or local seeds which they prefer. Farmers and their families are exposed to pesticides. More farmers each year go to the hospital because of pesticide exposure and cancers. When I arrived at one NGO that I've worked with in Wayanad district of Kerala, the first day I got there, the female head of the organization could not meet me. And her husband came and explained she was gone to a house that was mourning the death of a young man from cancer. Nobody in his family had ever, as far as they knew, his uncles, aunts, grandparents, great-grandparents, none of them had ever had cancer. But he had been convinced that rather than growing rice or other things, he was going to grow bananas for export to the EU. And so he had been exposed tremendously to pesticides. The connection between pesticides and cancer, we're getting more and more data on. And I did want to mention that if anyone wants, I have a graduate student who's been working with me for a while, actually it's two graduate students, we're putting together a bibliography on a very number of things and GMOs, the effects of GMOs on health, but there are several other things as well that she's categorizing. And if you want a copy of the bibliography, we'll be glad to send it, but you have to write to me and ask for it. The industrial model has very limited varieties. It cannot easily alternate crops. When we had a drought in 2012 in Iowa, it was exacerbated by the lack of water conservation and absence of soil biota. And under the US influence, China also subsidizes grains for animal feed. The SRI model is very easy to switch crops. For example, in 2000, I think it was 13, or it may have been 14. I'm not sure if it was 2013 or 14. The northeast monsoon was late in Tamil Nadu, and it was suggested to farmers that instead of growing rice, grow lentils during that season, using SCI. As a result, they got very enormous yields. They made tremendous profits in the market because lentils are still used for every kind of dal you can imagine, and mixed and other things, etc. It also is naturally responsive to climate variation. They work with millets, vegetables, tree crops, and various kinds of polycropping strategies. They tend to use different varieties of rice or wheat depending on particular soil conditions. It's not one variety for everything. And in fact, we know that the soils in India, like in the rest of the world, like everywhere you go, they can vary in the same village. They can even vary from plot to plot in some places. It's interesting that recently the Iowa State University and the University of Iowa did a study on 4-crop rotation, and they showed that they had equal yields, in some cases higher yields, and they had reductions in the toxicity of freshwater runoff, which is one of the major problems that using lots of pesticides and insecticides do. In some ways, because China has been pushed to be like the United States, they are somewhat less capable of dealing with drought conditions than they used to be. Their government subsidizes meat industry and agribusiness more than small farmers. And the result of that has been an interesting thing. China never had a problem with obesity or diabetes. Today, in the big cities of China, you see it all over the place. India had it all along, among the middle and upper classes at least. But it was never there in China. Industrial agriculture leads to this fertilizer runoff, a threat to lakes, rivers, and all bodies of water. Excessive tillage, which affects soil biota, especially those living directly under the soil, like earthworms. SRI agriculture leads to much greater biodiversity, deeper root systems allowing access to moisture and other nutrients, and protection against rainfall variation. And I have read, though I have not seen it, of all kinds of examples of how, when it was dry for a couple of weeks, when the dryness ended, it was only the SRI seedlings that came back up. I know that when there were cyclones have hit, it was the SRI seedlings that recovered after the cyclone people were recovering from the cyclone. Okay, there are questions raised in 2008-9 by the Norwegian report on viable futures. And they raised a very simple question. What kind of food production can drastically reduce poverty, reduce climate change and cool the planet, restore biodiversity, soil fertility, and water resources, improve livelihoods and provide employment for billions of people, and produce good and nutritious food for 9 billion people or even more, which is what the predictions have for 2050. There are two different approaches and suggestions. Small family farms can help the land cope with climate change by absorbing carbon and preventing CO2 and methane release into the atmosphere, and they can save on water. And if you're using something like SRI, SCI, you can be saving on water. This is important. Altieri is a professor of agroecology at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's done a lot of work on looking at all forms of agroecology, not just SRIs here. He notes that the smallest 2-hectare farm in the United States produced over $15,000 per hectare altogether, and netted, that is, after all the expenses of cultivation, close to $3,000 per hectare. The largest farms, averaging the farms themselves were over 15,000 hectares, yielded only $249 per hectare and netted $52. Small farmers, in other words, small farms, you can actually earn more per acre or hectare than you can in the very massive large farms. Small farmers have less environmental impact. There's an inverse relationship between farm size and output to more efficient use of land, water, biodiversity, and other agricultural resources. Agriculture in India is a state subject, and within each state, and not the central jurisdiction, there are different responses to the agrarian question. Tamil Nadu, for example, and Andhra Pradesh differ, or even Telangana and Andhra Pradesh today. Andhra Pradesh was far in advance of other state governments in some ways, all mostly because of one man who was killed in an airplane crash. I'm sure you all remember who he was. Yet, there's a very strong influence of the central government. Rural and semi-rural farmers were involved in diverse movements, particularly non-pesticide management and SRI management approaches in Andhra. Why are they so important? These are management techniques that vastly increase farmers' control over their own agriculture, using natural inputs and even bringing back traditional seeds. Use of these techniques is increasing annually, though it's still a work in progress. And I should point out that some of the old seeds that are being brought back are not causing suffering among the farmers. I know for a fact in Tamil Nadu that varieties of rice that were being consumed in the early 60s prior to the Green Revolution are now being grown again. Apart from the fact that they're getting good yields, they command an enormous price in the market because everybody likes them. They're very tasty. SCI successes have also been well documented, but though I am interested, and I'm trying to set up some research with other people, in research that will tell us the circumstances, both social and political, that lead to greater success, because it seems to work better in some states than in others, under some conditions than in others, etc. One thing that is clear is that governments need to provide subsidies to help with the adoption of new technologies, such as SRI, which require the learning of new ways of working in the fields, especially for the first 2 years, when soil is being regenerated and women are relearning totally new techniques, such as new ways of transplanting, new ways of learning anything new, as you all who are students know, takes time. It's not easy. You don't automatically learn how to do something that's different from what you've done. States also need to find ways of providing tenancy security, if not land reform. Village-level organic farming systems started in April. They started to use the MG Negra initiative to help with the initial years, but I don't know how it's happening today and what's happening since the new government. Okay, I want to talk about one other concept, and I don't know why these are coming this way, but it's the right of eminent domain. I don't know if you're familiar with how eminent domain came into being, but basically it was part of enclosure on the British Isles, and it was done to keep out all the tenant farmers and get them to go work in the factories because they had nothing else that they could do, no other way to survive. One of the things, though, that's happening in some places, it's happened already in the United States, but it's happening in some places, even in India, is the destruction of excellent double crop and triple crop farmland, or the cementing over farmland, or even cementing over your courtyard. something that started early in the United States and continues today through, though people are fighting for the rights to own land. And I should say one thing about the cementing over. I have a young girl who I think of as my niece who lives in Bangalore. One of her neighbors had cemented his entire courtyard, and he wondered why his well was not producing any water. And when someone said, make a whole bunch of holes in the, not a few, in the cement, he did and was absolutely shocked that his well was fine the next year. Because rainwater got in. I mean, rainwater harvesting, these are things that are easy to do if you think about it. You have to think about it. Eminent domain, though, is something that is you now have in India a new bill that makes it even easier for government to take away land from people. Our governments will claim that the land is simply wasteland. It can be used for grazing, it may have been for rotational fallows, routes through which cattle moved, or places kept for the landless poor, often Dalits. And the one thing that wasn't mentioned is the extensive work that I have done among Dalits in the past. And it's interesting that they are among the poorest of the poor in the agricultural areas because they don't always have right to own their own land. And I still have not talked to anybody in Tamil Nadu about it, but I came aware last time I was there that where they're pushing SRI, SCI, are not the areas where the Dalits own their own land, even when they have excellent sources of water on their land. Food sovereignty is the concept I want to talk about. It represents the right of each nation, each group of people, each locality to maintain and develop its own capacity to produce its own basic feeds. We have the right to produce our food in our own territory. And as La Via Campesina, which is an organization that was formed in Central America and some parts of South America, noted, food sovereignty is a precondition to food security. If people own their own seeds, but there's a real fear of seeds being cut, that means the right to secure land rights, even the state cannot take away in the name of economic development. Whereas the Green Revolution interfered with pro-people movements like land reform, while the latter switch to neoliberal politics pushed it even further in the opposite direction, we need to look at other things as well. It's interesting that today, land grabbing in Africa, especially Ethiopia, is very common. Many people from India who are very wealthy have been grabbing fertile farmland away from Africans, especially in Ethiopia, while at the same time this fertile farmland is being taken over. UP has said they plan to take 1/4 of the farmland eventually for highways, luxury residential complexes, and potential factories, which may never be built. Every time I come in from the Hyderabad airport, I'm shocked. And I think of how many shopkeepers lost their jobs, their work, and will not compensate. They may have been paid something, but that money gets lost very quickly. They weren't given shops and places to work on a continuous basis when it was taken away. The reckless handling of natural resources, such as removing sand from riverbeds and turning farmland into bricks for luxury homes, has led to gross environmental depletion. This is going on in one village I lived in both in 1970 and I'll get a little later. And it's still being worked in. It's one of the villages that I'm going to be visiting next week. Okay, I just would like to do another comparison between the corporate model and food sovereignty ones. The key players in the corporate model are multinational corporations, corporate owners in developing countries, the World Bank and the IMF, its affiliates. They control most food and farming operations. Whereas the key players in food sovereignty are the Human Rights Commission of the UN rapporteurs on food, the Scandinavian countries, small communities the world over, Slow Food, which is another international organization all over the world, smaller and regional organizations. And in both cases, that whether it's developed or developing, the focus is again on these family farms. Tools are needed for a fundamental new change to help with direct marketing, including what are called in the United States community-supported agriculture. Farmers markets, community-supported agriculture is when maybe 100 or 200 families who could afford it give a certain amount of money to a farm at the beginning of the season so the farmer doesn't have to take a single loan. And then throughout the season, every week, as they are able to go to a communal place and pick up a load of food for that week. Farmers markets are a big thing. Marketing directly to schools, factories, government institutions, marketing within local areas, through other small businesses. In Bangalore, where there are numbers of those, they often sell out all their organic vegetables by 11 in the morning. There's just nothing left, whether it's organic eggs or organic anything. It works because people buy it. Another thing is something called farmer-to-farmer spread of knowledge, and I'll talk to you about that later if we have time in the discussion. There also is beginning to be a revived interest in land reform and the right to land. Another thing is getting boosts from the food movement. Some governments in India are pushing for a focus on organic foods and water conservation. The old Andhra Pradesh, that is Telangana and AP today, is in the lead in this due to the dedication to eliminate poverty by some former chief ministers. And then I talk about an aquifer project in Maharashtra. According to the Center for Sustainable Agriculture in Secunderabad, today field experience shows that organizing community-managed seed systems where farmers can produce and share or sell seeds locally is ideal. There are several such models established by the CSA and other organizations in Warangal, Medak, Anantapur, Kadapa, Kurnool, Vijayanagar, and Visakhapatnam, and Srikakulam. If such models can be supported by the governments, the seed problem can be solved. Having seeds as open property that anyone can use and anyone can have is something that is totally different from the possession of seeds by a corporation that gets a patent on it. And we find that in India, at least, people are actually consciously, because they know about how some of these companies stole seeds in the early 1950s, 60s, I should say, and 70s. They're still to try to keep companies from knowing what they're using. I mean, the variety of, for example, rice that we were just shown in Bhubaneswar, in Orissa, just really floored us. There's so many. So what do we do? How do we answer the question that corporations raise? How can the world feed the 9 billion people projected for 2050? But NORAD notes that meat consumption in the United States, 120 kilograms per person per year, is outrageous. Not only is it outrageous, it produces heart conditions and other things, because they don't just eat the meat, they eat the fat. The world's average is 43 kg, and India's is 5 kg. How much meat do human beings need? Agro-business corporations, backed by massive subsidies and government support, have ramped up global industrial meat production, with devastating consequences for people, animals, and the environment. The transnational corporations in the global south have joined ranks with firms from the north to push big meat into every corner of the planet. China, Thailand, Brazil. I don't know how many of you have gone around the city of Hyderabad about these chicken kafos. I forget, kafo is confined animal feed operations. It's disgusting for the animals. they're not treated like living things, and it produces more chicken than is needed by human beings. And if you ever notice, because we used to get them when we lived in villages, the difference in the taste of the eggs from the chickens that run around and the ones that you can get from these, it's really quite striking. What is being done about the enormous pre- and post-harvest losses of food and other forms of waste? ETC groups have shown food waste in the United States to be 40% in 2009, an average of 1,400 kilocalories per day, more than half the calories needed to feed one adult. Yet we face significant hunger and malnutrition, even in the United States. In the US, only 36% of what is grown is consumed by human beings. The rest goes to fuel, animals, and multinational food corporations to turn into things like high fructose corn syrup, which then gives people more sugar than they need. How much food will be needed depends on how much waste can be avoided and how much is used for other purposes. But waste is profitable for companies. Increasing the scope and extent of sustainable agriculture, food security for all, including the rural and urban poor, along with their sense of human dignity and meeting their basic human needs, clearly depends on social movements, both in India and the rest of the world. Holt Hymenes, who's the head of Foods First in California, notes the corporate food regime may not be dying, but it is cracking as new food systems struggle to be born. The food crisis is a political one. And I want to finish with this slide where I basically show you factors that affect the future of food. And I have SRI in one place, corporate determination in another, and food movements and related movements for greater equality, more variety, and more autonomy. And this is going to determine what's going to happen in the future. I did have a few pictures of SRI to show people if they want to see it, but it's a different slide thing. And I'm not going to do it unless somebody wants to see it later on.